Right now, we're going to have Evan Saunders speak and talk about how his company uses mobile data. So Evan's with UberMedia, and he's a great guy. And without further ado, I want to let Evan talk about what they do. So welcome, Evan.
Thanks for having me here. Guess I'll turn on my webcam and take over control of the presentation. Appreciate that intro. It's awesome to see. I did not know that North Carolina was the 6th most visited state in the country, so that's impressive in of itself. But today we're talking a bit about, of course, North Carolina, and two main subjects here. The first being economic development, and the second being tourism. We had to get a presentation done in 20 minutes, so there's a lot more we'd probably want to dig into. But this presentation will give you a really good high-level insight on what mobile location data can do to provide insights, both for businesses engaging locals as well as tourism assets engaging tourists in-state and out-of-state. I'm going to start the presentation just talking a little bit about who UberMedia is, and more importantly, what mobile location data is. You should know we are not related to Uber, the car company. We've been around since before them. We're UberMedia, and we specialize in mobile location data. So we're going to drive into this. I think we'll have time for some questions at the end. But hopefully by the end of this, you'll get a pretty good understanding of what mobile location data can do from a high level as well as a micro level. Let me see if I can, well, there we go. So we work in tourism, as we mentioned. Over 100 destinations use our mobile location data for insights, not just here in America, but also around the world. A lot of them are for ongoing insights, but a lot are for project-based work. So when you think about mobile location data, it could be for something you just want to know about visitors over Memorial Day weekend or last weekend, and that's it. Or you might have ongoing updates that you care about when it comes to your visitors. We also work almost in every other industry outside of tourism: retail, restaurant, shopping centers, attractions, airports. Understanding visitors from a micro level as well as a macro level, whether you have one restaurant located in North Carolina or you have 10,000 fast food restaurants across America, mobile location data can provide a lot of great insights to your business, to your location, to your attraction, to your city or region. So what is mobile location data? Mobile location data is very much like a intercept survey. It's not meant to replace an intercept survey, it's meant to augment it. And so when you think about mobile location data, think about understanding your visitors, whether they're locals or tourists, much like a survey would do, except it's a bit like a survey on steroids because of the amount of data that we're able to collect from visitors anonymously from their mobile devices. So when you think about mobile location data, think about these three questions on your screen, because these are really the three questions that can be used to answer. The first is where people are coming from. And you can think of that: what local zip codes are they visiting? What DMAs or cities are they coming from? Out of state, what states are they coming from, or DMAs? So it can be very, very, very much like a micro level, even census block groups are they coming from, or a high level, what countries are they coming from? Or what states, of course. The what are they doing sounds exactly like that. Mobile location data is about people movement. So what restaurants are they going to? What shops are they visiting? What hotels are they staying at? What attractions are they going to? And then combining those two categories, so on economic development side, people who work in our city, what restaurants do they go to, versus people who live in our city, what restaurants do they go to? On the tourism side, what are in-state tourists versus out-of-state tourists doing? What are overnighting tourists versus day tripping tourists doing? What are tourists on the weekends versus the weekdays doing, or what are locals on the weekends versus the weekdays doing? So a lot of ways to combine those two categories with this type of data. And then the third one, who. So the data is all anonymous. We don't know who any of these people are. However, because we collect in a massive amount of data and we understand things like the region, areas people work, areas people live, what they do over the past 12 months. We can pull out audience profiling information, demographic information, some of which we'll touch on for this presentation. So just think about those 3 questions when you ask yourself, how can I use mobile location data? It can't be used to ask someone if they had fun on their visit to Charlotte, for example, or what their sentiment is. That's not what mobile location data is used for. It's more about people movement and that data. So where does it come from? It comes from apps on your phone. So if you've ever downloaded an app before and the app says this app would like to know your location while you're using it, could be a game app, a news app, a weather app, a sports app. As you opt in, you give off your location anonymously. UberMedia collects location data like this from over 150,000 different apps all around the world. These apps, though, don't give off your location 24/7. It gives off the location intermittently, sometimes every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, every hour, perchance. And what we're doing as a company, essentially, is we're like drinking from the fire hose mobile location data from devices all around the world, essentially understanding where they're going and what they're doing. And every day, all day, we are collecting this data literally 24/7. We're doing a lot of work to process it and contextualize it and make it really usable into data sets. So what does that mean? It means literally we're collecting data today. That data is usually not available for 2 or 3 days from now because of all the work we have to do to just make sure it's really accurate and usable. But that's safe to say a lot of our partners right now, in a way they had never done before, are getting data yesterday and today on what these visitors did last weekend, so they can set up marketing campaigns today to drive further revenue for this upcoming weekend. It's that instantaneous in many ways, and never before have we honestly needed to be that instantaneous, even in the world of tourism. So from collecting all of this data, we have access to data on over 1 billion people around the world, 300 million devices here in America. And because we're already collecting it all day, we already have all this data. So when you think about both residents and tourists in North Carolina, when we did the subsequent study I'm going to show you, we already had all this data. We collected this data. So it's more about the questions we have about what people are doing in North Carolina. And we go into our data to see how different was it pre-COVID, how different was it a year ago, or even how different was it last weekend. So it's a lot of fun, and we'll dive into some high-level insights, leveraging mobile location data for both economic development and tourism on this presentation. So first, we're going to look at North Carolina from an economic development perspective. And we're going to start really high level on this and then get down to some specifics. The specifics get really fun, but the high level lets us understand statewide trends. Obviously, trends that can be done on a county level easily, but statewide for the presentation that we're going to walk through today. The way we did this is we want to understand, are people going to quote unquote public places? Not did I get in my car and drive 100 miles to grandma's house, but did I get in my car and go and visit somewhere where I'm going to be in public, interacting with places? Some of these places are closed currently or have started to reopen. Some never closed, but they're all public places in our database. So we have over 1.5 million in our database. For North Carolina, I think we used around 35,000 public places to measure foot traffic across the state to understand foot traffic trends that we're going to walk you through in the subsequent slides. So let me explain what you're looking at first before we try to sort of dive into the data. So here you're looking essentially over the a 7-day moving average of foot traffic trends. So it's baselined to pre-COVID activity. So 100, so you see a scale on the left there, 100% means it is exactly what activity was like, people visiting these public places prior to COVID happening. A foot traffic index of 50 would mean it's down 50%. So we're taking tens of thousands of public locations, aggregating them together and understanding basically how down are we and how quickly is it ramping up as people start to do things. So the first thing to look at this sort of pre-COVID phase that's highlighted on your screen right here, which I found to be pretty interesting as we dug through the data, was when do we start seeing it go down? So obviously COVID-19 was in the news in February, was in the news early March, but here you see March 10th, the governor declaring a state of emergency. Still nothing closed on a statewide level, but as we saw shortly afterwards, many offices decided to do work from home policies, but most importantly, public schools closed. Public schools closing, parents need to stay home to watch their kids. Foot traffic across the industry level falls off a cliff almost, and rightfully so. So many people are staying at home. So many people are worried as well. There's so much unknown about COVID-19 that so many people are staying at home, that by the time the statewide stay-at-home order was put in place, many areas throughout the state had already had their local stay-at-home orders in place, but the statewide stay-at-home order actually really didn't impact anything from what we saw from foot traffic. Yes, it goes down slightly after that, but the real impact came on a more local level, as well as the schools clothing was just an interesting milestone to see on there. Now going into the everything's closed officially phase, what I would label it as, we see it basically essentially kind of flat, kind of moving down until April 20th. We see a little peak around Easter. People probably going grocery shopping, buying product to celebrate Easter. Makes a lot of sense. But then we see it going down until April about 20th. And then we actually, before any really massive regulations announced, we start seeing an increase in foot traffic to public places, which we'll get into a little more specifically on the next slide. But interestingly enough, is both, as we see both before COVID and kind of during this COVID crisis, is we see foot traffic resembling a lot of more local decision-making and not a statewide decision-making. We also see, and I looked up the weather patterns historically across North Carolina for mid-April, towards the end of April, and we see beautiful weather starting to creep up around the state. Some 70s, some even 80s popped in. Definitely people feeling that cabin fever, wanting to get out and see things. And we start seeing that into the data to the eventual phase 1, phase 2 opening that the state is experiencing. We're not seeing a massive increase, again, on a total industry-wide, statewide level here. We're seeing a little spike right after phase 1 was announced and a little spike right after phase 2 was announced, but we're not seeing massive increases. This is not atypical. We are not seeing massive increases anywhere. And a good question to ask ourselves here is demand outweighing anxiety when it comes to people going out to visit these public places? So going into more of the specifics on a sector by sector level. So these are various sectors: restaurants, retail, grocery stores, salons or spas. Some of these, as you can see, well, as you can see in the pre-COVID to sort of post-COVID transition there, they kind of fell off a cliff, rightfully so, just as we saw on the last slide. And a lot of these stayed closed, obviously, especially fitness and recreation, apparel, all these places stayed closed. Grocery stores, visitations down a little bit. We work with a lot of grocery chains actually across the country, but we're seeing higher price points. So individual customers are going less, but spending more money. Eating places obviously are down because the dining is closed, but still takeout is still existing, not for every business, but for many business. Fitness and recreation, you might expect to see negative 100%. But again, we're seeing still employees going in, cleaners going in, security checking places. So it's not necessarily meant to go down to 100%. And we're using the same data to baseline it before. So all of this really expected across the board. But the real question is, okay, phase 1 and phase 2 are now opening up. How have things changed? There's a sense of desire here to want to compare ourselves to what things were like either a year ago or the pre-COVID days. But what we're seeing in the data, especially from the previous slide, is we're not seeing any hockey stick growth. It's going to be challenging to constantly benchmark ourselves on a year ago or benchmark ourselves in the pre-COVID days. Rather, we understand, are we growing week over week? Do we see that growth? In what sectors are we seeing that growth? And are we happy about that? One thing we also, as we talked to a lot of states and cities, as well as individual businesses, we saw there was a desire to benchmark themselves against other destinations or other businesses. So we thought it would be insightful to take North Carolina, which was more conservative in its opening up approach. We're based in Los Angeles here. We are also conservative in our opening approach. Compare it to a place like Georgia, which was less conservative. So here on your slide, on the left right there, you're seeing North Carolina. On the right, the data is showing us Georgia here. And the biggest takeaway, like I could spend an hour digging into this slide and some of the data that supports it, but the biggest takeaway that we found, and the most interesting one, was when businesses opened in Georgia, restaurants became the most popular place, in addition to salons or spas, but restaurants became a huge growth sector, whereas North Carolina didn't see as much growth in restaurants. On the flip side, apparel, North Carolina saw great growth in apparel. People went out and to buy clothing, whereas Georgia didn't see that type of growth. So contrasting these two states and the public in those states and what they decide to do as things open up is really interesting for us. And of course, we want to kind of dig into that and understand what type of apparel, what type of restaurants, but we didn't have enough time on this presentation to do that. Specifically speaking, going to a more micro level, we just looked at really macro detail. Let's look really quickly at two locations because I can't spend too much time on them. But Whole Foods, obviously, this is a location that's been open the entire time. But we want to compare a pre-COVID visitor versus a basically phase 2 visitor. People feeling a little bit more friendly, able to go out. To summarize what you're looking at two trade areas. We build trade areas based on where people live, where they work, and what they were doing 30 minutes before they got to Whole Foods. So looking at these trade areas as combining this also with origin market and demographic data, we're seeing a much more hyper-local and concentrated visitor visiting this Whole Foods. Now, Whole Foods foot traffic probably isn't down as much, but we're seeing where their people are coming from is much more hyper-local, and as a result, a slightly more affluent visitor. We're also seeing the same in honestly a lot of places. This shouldn't be surprising to anyone. Here's a shopping center. It's an outdoor area. It's got a lot of different type of restaurant retail. Some businesses have opened, some have not. Here, a big takeaway is now we're focusing on the data of where people work, because pre-COVID, we saw people getting on highways and essentially driving there. We saw people coming after work to get there. Whereas now in phase 2, we're not seeing people leave their offices and come back and go shopping or go eating. We're seeing people come from home. And it's such a different, as we call it, path to purchase there to get to this shopping destination. And again, we could spend a lot of time digging into that, but just really interesting to see the data on both a macro and micro level there. So switching from economic development to now tourism, we want to ask ourselves, how is the tourism industry recovering? In a very similar capacity that we just reviewed economic development. But tourism is sometimes a consideration, a long-term tourism, like out of state coming into North Carolina. Sometimes they make a last-minute decision, but sometimes those people they're planning July 4th weekends right now in North Carolina, for example. It's a lot of not last-minute visitation. So who is visiting our places? Where is this coming from? We'll talk about that in the subsequent slides. So rather than use public places, we used actual tourism destinations throughout North Carolina. We came up with a list of about 70. Some are closed, some are opened. But the goal of this list was not just to look at today for this webinar. The data we're showing you is hopefully going to be a lot of fun to look at over the next 6 to 12 months to understand how tourism is interacting on a macro level as well as a micro level as we explore destinations throughout the state. So pre-COVID, and here we're starting off the first week of January right here. These are visitors to those 70 plus tourism locations, those assets. We're seeing pretty much flat, some peaks and valleys. Obviously, mid-February doesn't present the best weather, but we're seeing consistent trends that we usually always do in tourism until, of course, it falls off a cliff for every reason, not just the stay-at-home orders, but people have to stay at home and watch their kids. People are being furloughed right now. There's a lot of reasons why tourism assets are falling so dramatically. But again, what's so interesting about the data here is that it does mirror slightly economic development. The data actually looks a little bit better in many ways as economic development, and I'll explain in a second. But we're seeing that same sort of time frame, that April 19th, April 18th day, where we're starting to see a steady increase. visitors to those tourist locations, of people getting out and doing things. So they didn't wait to phase one for tourists to go out and do things like even visit parks or just be out and about in a public space, breathing that fresh air as weather got better. But what's really interesting, as opposed to economic development, is we're actually seeing a steady increase. We're not seeing flatlining here. Memorial Day weekend too, we're seeing a little bit of a spike and it goes down a little bit. But as this data goes on, interestingly enough, hopefully we'll continue to see growth in tourism. In economic development, if you recall back, we saw a little kind of flattening, staggering, people worried about getting out. Tourists are perhaps less worried about going and visiting tourism assets. And this is obviously something we'd love to dig into more, but it's a reassuring sign that hopefully this growth will continue throughout the summer, especially if cases stay low and people feel a little more confident to be out and about there. So taking those 70 locations, we graphed each of them. So this slide does look like my 1-year-old son took crayons and drew lines on here. But really, before we dug into the data, we really wanted to let's visualize all 70 plus of those tourism assets and see if there are any outliers that are driving this growth. And sure enough, there were some really interesting outliers that were driving this growth. And I'm sure everyone on this call is very familiar with these quote unquote tourism destinations, some that have taken different approaches to opening up. Biltmore has done a really good controlled opening. Reservation system, season ticket holders only, if season ticket holders. I honestly wish some places here in LA would adopt what Biltmore has done. I think it's really smart. And what you see in that light green color is you see confidence in a tourism visitor. You see it's going up. Obviously, employees and stuff were going there first, but you see it going up steadily, and you see people enjoying themselves, probably telling others it was a great experience going to Biltmore, and it's a very controlled growth and visitation there. So people are clearly feeling safe to go there as Biltmore opens up more things, if you will, more areas for people to visit and explore. That's contrasted a bit with the Umstead State Park. Super interesting to see that we see a massive growth. Phase 1 and 2 are announced. Phase 2 especially, we see people going there. It's great to be outdoors, as we all know, especially being cooped up at home, but we see it sort of drop off right afterwards. So you see a huge amount of visitation to this park, but we don't see sustained visitation, interestingly enough. And that might come out as we look more in the data as to why to that. Charlotte Motor Speedway, this is something too to be cautious of. We see massive growth, but that's not because fans are in the stands. It's because they're finally holding races, albeit private races, if you will. Public can't go. But we obviously that's going to create growth. So no matter what, we're going to see a lot of growth. The question is, do we see this sustained growth over the summer months as places sort of open up more? But interestingly enough, on Umstead, I wanted to look a little bit more about why we might not be seeing as much sustained growth. So comparing now year over year is what we're going to do. We're seeing, again, similar to the economic development side, we're seeing a much more highly concentrated local visitor coming to Umstead State Park. So people aren't driving nearly as far as they used to, and it's much more concentrated visitor, which means they might not want to go back to the same state park every time. And if Umstead isn't taking people from far distances or out of state and getting them to visit, it's probably not going to see that continued sustained growth, because people are going to the same sort of public areas and they might want to visit different public areas as opposed to the same attractions over and over again. So it would be so much fun to dig into this type of data and compare it to other parks throughout the state. On a macro level here, and again, that was really interesting comment about North Carolina being the 6th most visited state in the country. What we're looking at here is we're comparing local visitors to these tourism areas. We're comparing in-state tourists, domestic, out-of-state tourists, and international. Believe it or not, there are still internationals stuck in our country. I was in Boston a couple of weeks ago and saw a group of Italians walking around, kind of just enjoying the nice weather. But the big takeaway here is month over month, we see a massive shift in out-of-state visitors. We see over 10% less out-of-state visitors coming into North Carolina and doing things. A lot of reasons for that, but knowing that that there are going to be less out-of-state visitors coming, locals, people in state become extremely valuable tourists for the state of North Carolina. And North Carolina is not alone in that. Many states are now marketing to those in state and treating them as equally important as tourists to drive revenue from them. So this is going to be really interesting to monitor as we go into the summer months. So what does this all mean when we at UberMedia think about trying to deduct some conclusions from this? Well, we tried to sum it up in a really easy to understand manner. One of the things we've had fun doing in my household during quarantine is to ask ourselves, what do we have more of and what do we have less of? It's a nice, like, insightful question as you realize you just want things to go back to the way they were. So we tried to use this type of same approach with the data we just went through, not thinking about June or July, but fall. Let's anticipate where things are going, and let's try to understand the marketplace so that we can be less reactive and more proactive. So as we think about fall, these were our conclusions. We think about, obviously, there's going to be less long distance travel, more short distance travel. What does that mean for my shopping center? What does that mean for my city? What does that mean for my attraction? Great questions to answer. We see less abstinence from travel. So a lot of people are abstaining from traveling. They're worried about it very much. But in the future, we're seeing people traveling more safely, practicing safe travel, wearing masks, socially distancing, and being comfortable with that. And the Biltmore data speaks a little bit to that because people clearly are feeling safe showing up there. We see less focus on last year's data. Yes, everyone wants to know, are we back to normal? But normal is not around the corner, and when it comes to benchmarking ourselves to last year. So really understanding today, yesterday, last week, and how are we changing, who literally was our visitor last weekend, so we can drive more of those types of visitors this weekend, has become more critical than ever. We see less, I guess we could say, mom and pop locations, unfortunately, that result in less consumer choices and more, less fragmentation in the marketplace, especially from an economic development side. And then we see more retailers and restaurants, especially, comparing themselves against competitive locations. We see them scrutinizing their assets. Whether you're a tourism destination and you want to really promote your top destinations where you're seeing that growth, let's get more people to go and do that. Or you own 5 restaurants and you want to understand your different assets and how they're performing. And as a result of this, we're actually going to see more opportunity, which is a fun and exciting thing to focus on because it's exciting to focus on newness and opportunity. And I have a lot of fun, honestly, delving into that topic. So walk through that as fast as I can. That's the end of the slides as we talk about both economic development as well as tourism and leveraging mobile location data. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you now understand how mobile location data can be leveraged both on a macro as well as a micro level.
Well, that's outstanding. Thanks, Evan. It's really fascinating stuff to see. We're going to take some questions now. So if anybody has questions, you can type them into the chat bar on the right-hand side of your GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar. I'm going to read the first couple. So first one question is, how does your system distinguish one phone from a different phone?
Sure, great question. So each phone has a unique ID associated with it. You can almost think of it like a social security number for a phone or a serial number for a phone. So when we understand whether it's this phone or another phone, or whether this phone's using 5 different apps to give its location, it's all associated with the same, basically, device ID. And it's a unique device ID to that phone. Even if you switch SIM cards, it's that phone that it's recorded with. And so we can track data from that phone on a GPS level. So it's all accurate within about 9-10 feet.
That's fantastic. We had somebody ask how they can opt out of that if they don't want to be counted in it.
Yeah, the data is all anonymous, but you can absolutely opt out from that. You can also just, when an app on your phone says, do you want to share your location, you just hit no on that app.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And we deal with that a lot when we try and talk about this data and say, we don't know who you are. We just know what you're doing, which actually helps, I think, that consumer too, because you're going to get better ads because they're going to be based on what you actually do and what you care about, rather than not, just stuff you don't care about. So I
Sure.
think in a lot of ways there's a fear of it checking up on you, but it's not really you. It's just a person.
Yeah, we really look at it too from an aggregate level. There is no one, for better or worse, cares what Evan is doing, but they might care about people who live in or work where our office is right here. Where do they eat at lunch? The good thing is there's so much data here that even if 100,000 people opted out tomorrow in North Carolina, we honestly have more data than we know what to do with. So which is exciting in of itself. But yeah, it's all aggregated and anonymous anyway.
Okay. How do you know the home base of a phone / person? Area codes, etc. doesn't mean anything in our mobile society.
Absolutely. I live in LA and I'm from Boston, and I will keep my 617 number for life. But no, so the way we know where people live and work is based off of two methodologies. About living or their home location is we look at a methodology called common evening location. So where does this phone go back to almost every evening on average over the past 3 months? That is this phone's common evening, location. That must be where this phone lives. On the flip side, where does this phone go home or go during working hours on a regular basis over the past 3 months? That must be where that phone works. And again, it's down to a GPS level, but we never really need that. We usually we contextualize it like the census block group they live, or the zip code they live, or the county or the state or the country region, to help map out where people living and where people working. If we can't 100% identify it, let's say you bought a phone last week, or let's say you work for UPS and you're always in a different area, we actually throw out that data. We don't guess those common evening or common daytime locations. We want to be 100% accurate, or we don't include it in our data set.
That's great. That's fascinating. It kind of relates to another question that somebody had, is like the Charlotte Motor Speedway. Is there a way of pulling out employees so that you get actually just the visitors rather than the people who are going to jobs or things like that?
Absolutely. There's a few ways to look at it. On the economic development side, yes, for example, it's a shopping center. We want to look who works at that shopping center, their common daytime location, or even their common evening location. If they're at that shopping center overnight or during the day, we will remove them from the data set. Similarly, on the tourism side, we usually, and this can be defined by the destination, but let's say 85% of the time, this is the methodology. We want to find someone that lives at least 50 miles away and does not work in the study destination to call them a tourist. And like here in LA, we literally do have people that commute 50 plus miles to work, even though they live 50 miles away. But still, if they work in LA, they're not a tourist. So we have to look at both where they live and where they work to make that type of calculation.
Right. And so you can do that. You can pull those out, and then it's really truly a calculation of visitors.
Yeah. And truthfully too, like here, a lot of downtown areas, they want to understand who works in the downtown, because where do they shop? Where, what 7-Elevens are they going to? What supermarkets are they going to on their way home from work? What roads are they taking as they commute? There's a lot of stuff to dig into on that.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating about the travel patterns, because I've really noticed that, it used to be everything was centered around that morning and afternoon commute. Now things are much freer in how people can travel, and you don't have to get on that highway all the time.
It's very true. Yeah, we'll see that as businesses open up and people can go back to the office. That's one thing that we'll really monitor. Here UberMedia, our offices are open now, but as I sort of look out here from this conference room, I'm seeing 50 desks and 2 other people here. So even though, as we see in the data, things are opening, people are not rushing back, or even if they do, some people here have been coming 1 or 2 days a week. They're not coming all 5 days a week. So that's where in the economic development side, we're seeing a slower approach. But in the tourism side, it's especially when we poll our own company internally, everyone wants to do things this summer. They're trying to figure out what to do, when to do it, but they are excited to do things. And when I say things, there's so many different answers to that category. Some people feel comfortable flying, others don't feel comfortable flying, but they all want to get out and do something tourism related. And that's exciting in of itself.
Yeah, that's great to see. And our plan is to get people in North Carolina to do that and do it the right way too. So we had another question. What is the proximity accuracy to a POI for a device to be tracked?
Sure. So it's we basically, what we do is we geofence a point of interest, which means we like draw a line around a point of interest. And if someone enters that point of interest and we pick them up, we capture them in our data set. The data itself is accurate at about 9 feet, 3 meters, which is fine when someone's visiting a park, staying at a hotel, visiting a city. The one caveat to that is usually in strip malls. Sometimes in strip malls, we have very narrow retailers. So we know they visited the strip mall, but maybe we don't know if they're necessarily in the Starbucks or the AT&T because they're so close to each other, but we know they went there, and that's just sort of something to recognize in the data when you're looking at it.
That's fascinating. We have another question. Is this similar technology that is being used in South Korea for COVID-19 tracking and reporting?
It is and it isn't. So in South Korea, from my understanding, they're also using Bluetooth technology. Bluetooth on your phone is a very short range. It's what I'm using for my headphones right there. And they're using it to basically see, did my phone come in close contact with another phone via Bluetooth? So that's a little bit different. There is a GPS element too. So even in China, they want to know people arriving to Beijing need to self-quarantine in Beijing for 14 days before they're able to go out and go places. And GPS technology is better used to understand, did someone show up in Beijing and that they've been in Beijing for 14 days. So, but yeah.
That's great. That's fascinating. That's all the questions we have right now. I really want to thank Evan for coming and for hosting us. We do have Evan's presentation as a handout. If you see, it's in the handout tab on the right for people who are interested in seeing that. If you have any other questions, you can just email me. I'm wit@visitnc.com, and we can try and get Evan to answer any other questions if anybody comes up with them. Really appreciate what you're doing. I think it's made a tremendous difference in how we market and made our marketing that much better, thanks to the things that you guys do. So we really appreciate what you do.
Thanks for having me here. As you can see, I'm pretty passionate about this topic, and our core product, if you will, is this aggregated mobile location data. And there's a lot of questions you can ask yourselves about this. And you know, for better or worse, there's never been more focus on data, it seems like, around the world. And it's going to be really interesting to see how things shape out in the coming months. But fortunately, our company is pretty bullish on tourism. It's an exciting topic. People clearly want to go out, spend their money, and do things out about, either it's locally or around the world. So I can't wait to see how things progress through July 4th weekend and onwards.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Ann, and everybody. We'll see you again sometime soon for another webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Evan.
Andy.